As election integrity concerns continue to abound and lawsuits from the Trump campaign make their way into courts across the country, how are we to assess the current state of affairs? And what's legitimate or not legitimate in terms of complaints? What are the kinds of things we should be looking for when it comes to fraud allegations and more? Today, we'll talk with the former Secretary of State for Colorado, which is the third state that ever went ahead and tried statewide vote by mail, Wayne Williams, on a special Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, as we dive in part to an op-ed that I published for the Examiner on this very topic. Jimmy at the Crossroads with yours truly, Jimmy Sengenberger, starts right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program. Once again, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner here on a Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of the program. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you here today. If you have not done so already, please be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. In addition, follow me on Twitter and tweet at me at Sang Center. You see it right on the screen, Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. And of course, please, if you like our content, like it, click that like button, and share it on social media. We do appreciate your support. And be sure to follow our friends at the Washington Examiner online at washingtonexaminer.com. So today is a Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of this program, as I mentioned, and it's going to be unique in sort of how we approach it. Usually we have a guest on who is someone who's either a reporter or a commentary writer at the Examiner. Well, today we're going to talk about an op-ed I co-authored with Suzanne Taheri. She is the former Deputy Secretary of State for Colorado, in the Washington Examiner, out just yesterday, entitled "Legitimate Voting Systems Must Answer These Three Questions." And we dove into, well, as the title suggests, three key questions that legitimate voting systems must answer in order to catch fraud and to be a system that people can view with real integrity when it comes to the electoral process. And in our op-ed, we quote the former Secretary of State for Colorado, Wayne Williams, who is actually my guest on this Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of the show. He is the former Secretary of State for Colorado from 2015 in January to January of 2019. Prior to that, he was clerk and recorder for one of the state's largest counties, El Paso County, and was clerk and recorder of El Paso County when Colorado made the switch to statewide vote by mail and was the third state to do so, following Oregon and Washington. Wayne Williams rejoins me here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Sir, welcome back. It's good to have you.
Thanks, Jimmy. Good to be with you today.
Thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And first, we're still a week away from Thanksgiving, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to explain the Christmas tree that is right behind you.
So Holly and I are grandparents, and our granddaughter is able to visit us over Thanksgiving. She lives in another state, so she won't be able to be here for Christmas. So we wanted to get the house holiday ready in advance of her arrival later this week. So that's why you see the Christmas tree in advance. And yes, it is a patriotic Christmas tree because, as it says, we're proud to be Americans here in the Williams household.
I just had to ask it because it's a little bit, for me, like it's Thanksgiving. That's when we can start with all the Christmas trees and all that, but I totally get it. I'm right there with you. All right, Secretary Williams, so I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to chat with you. And I really wanted to have this conversation because of what we're seeing as far as vote by mail right now, a lot of concerns of what's happening across the country. Can you go ahead and just sort of give us a basic history? We'll get into the details of Colorado's vote by mail system and how that can really provide some good guideposts for other states that have replicated, and for voters in other states to look and feel confident in their election systems. So I'd love to start first with the background of what it took to actually get Colorado ready to move forward with a vote by mail system, because it wasn't something that happened in a span of months like many states across the country right now, right?
That's correct. Colorado used a series of processes. We began with no excuse absentee balloting. So that's what we had initially. And then we moved to you could become a permanent mail-in voter. That over time, a number of Coloradans took advantage of that. In fact, by the time we began mailing to all voters, 70% had already opted in to being a permanent mail-in voter, in part because Colorado lets you vote on many more issues than most other states do, including tax and debt issues for government have to go to the voters. And so we actually ask you to make complex financial decisions. Voters prefer to do that with the ability to actually look at the dollars and cents of those transactions. We also have the opportunity to vote on a host of other issues. We had one for gray wolves, for example, on the ballot this last year. And so you have that ability to have lots of complex issues. And as a result, voters preferred to vote by mail. So in 2013, with 70% already voting by mail, Colorado made the switch to send a mail ballot to everybody. There were a few glitches in the initial legislation that we worked out over the subsequent years. And now we've got a system that works very well in the state of Colorado.
Not just well because we're in Colorado are we saying that, but it's actually been nationally recognized, especially during your tenure as Secretary of State, by people on both sides of the political aisle.
The Washington Post called Colorado the safest state in America to vote. President Trump's Homeland Security Secretary also said that Colorado was the model for other states to follow.
Yeah, and that's one thing that has really been important in this state, is to be that kind of a model, which is why when Suzanne Taheri and I partnered up on this piece, I really wanted to make sure that we were getting to Colorado as a model for comparison, because we have a lot of things in this state that I just think a number of other states are woefully inadequate in. And so I want to break it down with you, former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams, in terms of each of these particular questions that we asked. Talk about Colorado and talk about how some of the other states may come into play as far as concerns and so forth. And so the big thing that to keep in mind that you pointed out as well is that Colorado over a decade, for more than a decade, was developing to a point where finally had 70% of people that were basically already getting ballots by mail. So it made much more sense to move forward than some other states that haven't gotten to that point. But one thing that is critical that you learn when going through this kind of a process is how important a voter registration database is. So question number one in the piece for the Examiner was, how reliable was or is your voter registration database? Talk to us about the importance of that and what Colorado does to ensure that things are accurate in the voter list.
Well, if you're sending out ballots to people, whether they show up or not, and that's what a mail ballot election involves, then you need to make sure you're actually sending it to people who are legitimately registered to vote and are eligible to vote in that particular election. So in Colorado, we take a number of steps to ensure that. First, we use the post office to let us know if someone's moved. We use driver's licenses. So if you change your driver's license address, we update your voter registration address. We get lists from the Department of Corrections and sheriffs for individuals who are incarcerated for felonies and therefore under Colorado law are ineligible to vote. We check the list against databases in terms of citizenship. We check the list against databases in terms of who is still alive, so the Social Security Death Index, and also a list of deaths from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So we're getting lots of lists to make sure that our list is as accurate as it can be. That means that when we send out a ballot, we know to whom it is going, and we know that someone is generally going to be at that address. And those are important steps, because if your list isn't accurate, then you're going to be sending ballots to people who aren't eligible. And when we send that ballot out, it's not forwardable, meaning it cannot be sent to a subsequent address. That voter must receive it at that address.
And I think that's an important component, because you want to make sure that the person is still living in that area to which they're registered to vote, so they're properly voting in that election, right?
Absolutely correct. People move, and even moving across the street could change which state representative district you're in, or any of a number of other boundaries.
We've heard of, over the last few years, actually many years, you see different lawsuits that come about of voter lists that are out of date and so forth. So that is something is fundamental to making sure that people are getting ballots who are supposed to get these ballots. Also, that you make sure that people get ballots if they're supposed to get a ballot. You want to ensure that in terms of the right to vote. But in addition, making sure, and we'll talk in a little bit about signature verification, making sure that people are getting the right ballot is critical for verification purposes too.
It is, and you have to get that ballot. So Colorado also checks with other states through the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, to try to make sure that multiple states aren't sending the same individual a ballot.
Absolutely. Once again, Wayne Williams, who was Secretary of State for Colorado from 2015 to 2019. Here's the next question. This is critical in terms of ballot returns and chains of custody. We pose this question, which is, are ballot returns secure and properly surveilled with bipartisan chains of custody? There are a lot of drop boxes that were put in place this election in a variety of states, but only I think 8 states actually address the idea of ballot drop boxes in statute. Colorado is one of those states. Arizona is another one of those states. And by the way, in Arizona, the only requirement that they have is that they be secure. They're not specific about the legislation. But in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia, they offer drop boxes in many localities, but that's not in statute. So there weren't actually any specific requirements in the law that said, okay, you must do X, Y, and Z to secure any of these ballot drop boxes in terms of procedure. Secretary Williams, in Colorado, what are the different requirements for ballot drop boxes themselves? We'll get to chain of custody and that process in a moment, to make sure that there isn't tampering that's going on.
So we start first, that ballot drop box has to be in a secured location, meaning it can't be a location that someone can just walk off with the box. In most of the cases, they are cemented into the ground, or they are actually physically in the side of a building. So it's not something you can walk away with. The other part of it, though, is to ensure that it is always secure throughout the process. In Colorado, they are under 24/7 video surveillance, and those tapes are preserved. And if anyone wants to challenge a particular matter, they have the ability to use those tapes in evidence, so you can actually track and make sure that nobody tampered with a ballot box, nobody took out ballots or did something nefarious with those ballots in any way. And that's important, because based on where the drop box is located, you can have a pretty good idea of who may be dropping off ballots, because you know demographically whether there are more Democrats or Republicans in a particular area. And so you need to make sure that that ballot drop box is secured and under video surveillance.
Yeah, so it needs to be secured in a secure location. They need to be lit as well. That's in the statute. And you have to make sure that there's some kind of surveillance. Either if somebody's there 24/7, then great. But generally speaking, you're talking about camera surveillance. And that's so critical to make sure that people can trust that when their ballot goes into the drop box, that it's going to make it safely to that destination. I know I have voted in a ballot drop box for I don't know how many years here in Colorado, particularly because I trust that aspect of the process. What do you make then, Secretary Williams, of the fact that there are a number of states that moved forward with ballot drop boxes without them being authorized in statute and not having any specific requirements as to how secure those ballot drop boxes are?
So if you're running a mail ballot election and you're not protecting the integrity of those drop locations, there's a problem. And we don't know what the scope of it is because there's no surveillance that tells us what the scope of it may be. People need to have that assurance and that confidence in the process. And you don't walk into a bank, for example, and they have a sign that says, please take the money that's only yours. Instead, they have security precautions, not because most of us are bank robbers, but because they have those precautions to protect and also so that people know it's protected. You need the same thing in a voting process.
Former Colorado Secretary of State Wynne Williams, let's talk about chain of custody, which means when a voter casts their ballot and provides it to the government in whatever way, maybe it's a drop box, maybe it's by mail, maybe it like actually in the mailbox, or maybe it is a voter center, a vote center location, that every step of the way that ballot is tracked and there's some sort of proof that it has been, that they have followed through the appropriate customs and all of those kinds of things. What does Colorado do as far as ensuring chain of custody and also a bipartisan nature so that Republicans and Democrats, of course, the two primary political parties across the country, can feel confident and trust what's going on with the process?
So Colorado has specific limits on ballot harvesting, stopping an individual from showing up at your door and taking your ballot, at least more than 10 in an election, because you might have family members or friends who need to drop one off, but there's a cap. Then when you go to the actual drop box, which is under video surveillance, as we just talked about, that's picked up by a bipartisan team of judges who then transport it together, even in the midst of COVID. You had a Democrat and Republican driving together with the ballots to a secure location, in most cases the county clerk's main office, which is then also under video surveillance. And so at every step of the way, you have someone from each party who is part of that process. A Dropbox that is monitored by only one party or picked up by only one party isn't secure because you don't know what's happening. And Jimmy, that's true whether you're talking transporting ballots from a polling place election, from a vote center, from a drop box, picking them up from the post office. In every one of those instances, you need to have a bipartisan team of judges who are with that group of ballots at all times to ensure that no one tampers with the ballots, either by taking them, or by opening and changing, or any other process that would be inappropriate. And so part of that, when we talk about this bipartisan team of judges, is the parties need to be able to pick those judges. So it's not the clerk who picks, oh, I like this Democrat because they will wink at me when I make some tampering decisions, or Republican, or vice versa. Instead, the parties actually choose. And so Colorado does that. Colorado, like many jurisdictions, has some counties that are predominantly Democrat, predominantly Republican. When I was Secretary of State, we had the county of Boulder, which is predominantly Democrat, say, we can't get enough Republican judges. And so we worked to adopt a rule and then ultimately provide specific legislation authorizing counties who need to use judges and other workers in that election process from other counties to ensure the bipartisan nature. In some states, Pennsylvania, for example, there was a proposal to allow that to happen, but it got quashed in the legislature and did not go into law. And so you have some jurisdictions that simply don't have enough Democrats or enough Republicans to provide enough judges. And so you wind up without that critical bipartisan part of the process.
Yeah, and you called that on my radio show this past weekend. You called that atrocious because you have to make sure that both sides are guaranteed that sort of confidence.
Absolutely. And in Colorado, we just don't say the judges come from that. We also have both parties can appoint watchers that can observe the process. And I understand it's understand, at least from some media reports, that some individuals were kicked out and weren't allowed to observe parts of the process. The process, your ballot, your particular vote is secret, but the process of counting those votes is not secret. It should be open and observable and verifiable.
Yeah, and if you're going to be able to track what's happening, you have to have first that kind of camera surveillance on Dropbox locations in particular. You have to be able to verify that the chain of custody, especially by having two judges and bipartisan, and also criminal background check. In Colorado, they have a criminal background check. A lot of states just don't provide that sort of confidence. You were talking about Pennsylvania. I mean, that's just striking to me that you don't have any allowance to make sure that if there is a political party that doesn't have as many people there, that doesn't mean that they're deprived the ability to have that reliable bipartisan judging situation going on, especially when election integrity is the name of the game. If you can't have trust in the process, what do you have?
Yeah, and throughout the process, and this is one of the responses, that whether you're a Democrat election official or a Republican election official, you should be able to articulate, I may be a Republican, I may be a Democrat, but I have judges at every step of the way who are from the other party and are watching and are part of this process, and they ensure that things are done properly in my county.
Now let's shift gears to question number 3 from the article that I co-authored with Suzanne Taheri, who is the former Deputy Secretary of State for Colorado under 2 administrations, including our guest Wayne Williams' administration. Is there a robust signature verification and cure process? Now, this is critical because you have to make sure that when a voter is casting a ballot, they are the voter they claim to be. Now, in Colorado, for example, you begin with a voter ID. So you have to provide a voter ID when you're starting that process. But after that, there is a very robust signature verification process, and there's a law and statute here that requires it in all types of voting, whether you are going to a voting center on election day and you want to vote and get a ballot there, or if you're doing your ballot that you received by mail, you have to have that kind of verification. And then there's what's called a cure process if your ballot is rejected because a signature doesn't match. Talk to us about that process in Colorado.
We look at every single ballot that comes in, and we actually look at the ballot envelope. It has a signature on it. We compare that signature to the signature on file. If there's a question about it, it's raised to a bipartisan team of judges, a Democrat and a Republican, and if both of them agree the signature does not match, then the voter is sent a letter saying, hey, your signature does not match. Important to note, they don't know what's on the inside of the ballot envelope at the time they're making this decision. So they're doing it without regard to whether this person may have voted for a Democrat or a Republican. They're simply part of the process. So I know this works. I sent a letter when I was county clerk to my own daughter. The judges, when her signature came in, it had become a scrawl as opposed to the carefully formed letters that were on her signature on file. And so she was sent a letter that says, hey, your signature doesn't match. But in Colorado, you got lots of ways to cure that. You provide a copy of your identification and you say, this is the process that we used. This is a copy of my driver's license, and you can email it, you can mail it, you can hand deliver it, you can send it via various fashions. And so you verify under oath that it actually is you. If you do not do that, then it gets referred to the DA for investigation afterwards. But this is a critical part of election integrity. You're going to mail out ballots, and you hear reports and occasionally actual documented evidence that, hey, there were a bunch of ballots that were thrown away in this garbage can at the post office. People got their ballots in their P.O. box and then just tossed it rather than vote it. How do you know those weren't voted improperly? And the answer is we verify the signatures to make sure they match, and we investigate where they do not. And that's a critical part of the process, so that you actually know that vote was cast by someone who's legally eligible to vote.
One of the things that was very disturbing about Pennsylvania is that the Supreme Court there threw out their signature verification requirement only for mail ballots, by the way, not if you voted in person, but for mail ballots, you had to, they tossed out the signature verification requirement. What's the problem with that? Why is that a bad idea?
Well, the problem with that is you don't know who actually cast the ballot. You don't know, and particularly, so in Pennsylvania, you have a partisanly elected Supreme Court, so it's a Democratic Supreme Court. And my understanding is that the majority of absentee ballots were sent out to Democrats. And so if you have a system that says we're checking the Democrats' signatures and not the Republicans' signatures, or vice versa, which is what they held, we're going to check Republicans, but we're not going to check Democrats, is the effect of if most of the people voting by absentee were Democratic, which is what the reports were. That's a real problem because you have to have the confidence that those votes that are cast by mail are actually cast by legitimate voters. And without that, you don't have any integrity in that system.
Yeah, the legitimacy of the process rests on the extent to which the people can trust that the participants are actually eligible. So when Republicans talk about count every legal vote, that's what they mean is that you're actually verifying that the votes that are counted are those that have been cast by people who are who they say they are and are legitimately registered and have been verified. And then, like in Colorado, there is that cure process when it comes to a rejection.
Yeah, so you've got up to 8 days after the election to cure. And in a close election, believe me, this, by the way, is a public record. So the campaigns, the parties get the list of who are the people who need to cure. And they are absolutely following up with the people they believe are their supporters.
Yeah. In fact, let me just give an example where we just had a very contentious district attorney race in the largest judicial district in the state, the 18th judicial district. It includes 4 counties, including Arapahoe County and Douglas County. And Douglas County is a traditionally very conservative county. Arapahoe County has changed. I'm in Arapahoe County. It's very much a blue county. And John Kellner, it looks like they're going through a recount process, I think, but that he's managed to, particularly because of that ballot cure process, secure and maintain a Republican district attorney in that judicial district. And that's a very close process. Also, the county commissioner for my parents, after a cure process was undergone, he was able to secure that post and hold on as in his reelection bid, a man named Jeff Baker. So it really is an important component.
It is, and you've got to have a way for it to be cured. But you also absolutely have to check that process, make sure those figures match. And Jimmy, it's probably worth noting here that sometimes you will hear someone cite partial data, and they will say, well, there aren't many convictions for voter fraud in a election. There's a difference between perpetrating the act and being convicted for it. And so in Colorado, there are literally thousands of ballots that are disqualified because they were turned in. But in most cases, there's no prosecution because we don't know who actually did turn it in. We just know that it wasn't Jimmy Sengenberger, it was someone else who turned it in.
Wait.
And see, sometimes people cite a study that says, oh, well, there aren't many convictions. Well, the question isn't whether someone was convicted. The question is whether it occurred.
Yes.
And so it's much like saying, someone wasn't killed because the murderer wasn't convicted, which is absolutely absurd. The person is dead. We can see the gunshot wounds. We just don't know who shot them.
Right.
So in Colorado, we can say those attempts to cast a ballot illegally were blocked. We do signature verification. They were not cast successfully. We gave, if it actually was the legitimate person, they had an opportunity to cure. And so that process is very different from one in which you just accept any ballot that gets turned in, regardless of who actually turned it in. One other important thing to note, in a bill proposed and passed by the U.S. House, the Democrats there say that in passing that bill in the U.S. House, they said that the signature verification cannot require identification. So you just have no real way of actually verifying that person is the individual, and that importance of identification. is absolutely critical in ensuring the integrity of the elections process.
Once again, we're talking with former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And I want to talk for a moment about signature verification and rejections, particularly in terms of percentages, how often that actually happens. So, for example, last week, the Republican Party chairman, or the chairman of the Republican Party in Georgia, David Schaefer, put out a tweet in which he said, in part, in 2018, when 230,000 absentee ballots were cast, 3.5% were rejected for signature mismatches or other reasons. In 2020, when more than 1.2 million absentee ballots were cast, the rejection rate fell to 0.3%. Now, they are undergoing a statewide hand audit of the presidential election right now in Georgia, but that doesn't include a reevaluation, as I understand it, of the ballots that were cast and whether or not they were legitimate, because those ballots have now been separated from the ballot envelopes in which they were returned. But this does concern me, Secretary Williams, particularly because that's a huge change from 3.5% with significantly fewer voters who voted absentee in 2018 to 0.3% this year with vastly more absentee votes that were cast. I'm concerned about that change. What do you make of it?
So I would really need to dig into the details. I can tell you that in Colorado, we tend to hover around a 0.5% rejection rate, give or take a tenth of a point or two. And so 0.3% isn't impossible to achieve. In terms of, is that a legitimate rejection rate? I would want to look at, are there differences in the processes that were used in Georgia between the two elections? Is there a difference in who did return absentee ballots during the election? For example, if individuals who were infirm were primarily the ones who voted in the primary, you could very well expect that many of them may have had a deteriorated signature that might have been more likely to have been identified as something that did not match. You also might have better training of judges. So any of a host of things could explain it that are legitimate. There are also possibilities that something could have been changed where the standards were made too loose. And so that's an examination that Georgia would need to undertake. With respect to the point you raised, Jimmy, can you go back and put the genie back in the bottle? The answer is no, because those ballots, once obtained, out of the envelopes are no longer traceable back to the envelopes from which they came. That's how we preserve the secret ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. When I look at this and I see 1.2 million absentee ballots versus 230,000 absentee ballots, and that kind of a stark difference, especially given how Colorado really honed in on these vote-by-mail practices over many years to get to that average of about 0.5%, certainly something they have to look into. Just a real quick final question for you, former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams, and I appreciate your time today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Risk-limiting audits. This is something that's mentioned in another piece that Suzanne Taheri, former Deputy Secretary of State for Colorado, and I mentioned in a Federalist piece. But risk-limiting audits are something that Colorado embarked on, and in particular in 2017, I think, is when we started doing that statewide. Can you just speak to that for a moment? Because I think that's a really important security measure.
Sure. Regardless of which system you use, regardless of which machines, which tabulation system, you need to make sure that it was conducted accurately. And you test the machines ahead of time, but it's also critical that they be audited afterwards. And so in Colorado, we are able to retrieve the cast vote record so we can tell how the machine interpreted each ballot that was cast in Colorado. And what we do is we choose a random number of ballots. The closer the race, the more ballots chosen. And we tell a bipartisan team of judges in each county to go back and look at the specific ballot and compare it to the specific cast vote record and ensure that it matches. And every one of our counties in every one of our elections since beginning it has passed that risk limiting audit. But that's a critical step because there are possibilities that maybe someone didn't follow security protocols, that maybe there was a glitch of some sort. And so you have to examine the results to make sure they match the actual ballots, and you compare that with the cast vote record. So in Colorado, we can tell you that no one in Beijing, no one in Moscow changed a single ballot in our state.
I lied. One final question, because there are a lot of people who are asking about Dominion voting systems. And there's a lot of concern. The Trump campaign has been talking about questions swirling regarding Dominion voting systems and the possibility for tampering with their software or inherent problems or corruptions within the software. I know that Colorado has used Dominion voting systems equipment for years, particularly going back to 2015, 2016. Can you just talk to your experience as Secretary of State in the past with Dominion and some of the concerns that are being expressed regarding its reliability?
Sure. First, Dominion is a certified system. We chose the standards that resulted in Dominion being selected by many of our counties after an exhaustive process that was public and looked at all of the different issues concerning all of the different systems. But we have tested that system. We didn't just rely on the federal certification and the testing that takes place as part of that. We test every piece of equipment used in every election. There have been over 400 tests done by counties prior to the election. When you bring in the other tests that are done after the election, the risk limiting audit we were just talking about, there have been a total of, I think it's 807 tests of Dominion software in Colorado. They have passed, Jimmy, every single one of those tests. And that is a very robust system of testing that tells us that, at least with the procedures we have in Colorado, with the processes and the protections we have in Colorado, that the Dominion system has counted accurately 807 out of 807 times. And those aren't just a single ballot test. Those are multiple hundreds of ballots, in some cases thousands, that are compared, and we can tell you that it counts accurately in Colorado.
And if you look at the accusations regarding Dominion, it seems like they're mostly, and this has happened in the past with Colorado too, human error with the software that has been used, with the equipment. And whereas the points that we were talking about before in terms of signature verification, in terms of making sure that you have voter ID, legitimacy in the process, those are the key things to be able to systemically catch human error and have the controls in place to prevent misuse of a system like Dominion. And that's what it really comes down to me, is how are your systems and how are your safeguards and controls in your individual states? That's the problem, the issue.
Absolutely. No matter how good a system may be, if you use it improperly, if you input the wrong data, if you say there is an extra race over what you programmed it for, which is what happened in one Michigan county, then you're not going to get accurate results from it. And that's why you do these audits. So if there is an error, you catch them. That's why we use that process in Colorado. We don't just rely on those preliminary tests that were done. We test afterwards. We make sure it works. We make sure every step was done properly. There are security protocols in place with respect to every one of these machines. That's true across the country. But I'm not sure, and I can't speak to whether other states have that same level of enforcement that we do here in Colorado.
Yeah, and that's the key question, and that's why we wanted to pose these particular questions as guideposts for folks to evaluate their state's systems. Former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams, a Republican, by the way, I so appreciate you rejoining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks so much for taking the time, and a very Merry Christmas to you as well, my friend.
And happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you as well. Thank you, sir. Once again, former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams, a Republican, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And I have to tell you that Wayne Williams, bar none, is top of his game. He knows elections inside and out. He's somebody that I absolutely trust as an expert on election issues. And by the way, it is a damn shame that he is no longer Secretary of State and was replaced by a partisan Democratic actor so far to the left that she actually last year had Planned Parenthood review talking points and suggest edits that she made on a press release before she released it. Absolutely extraordinary. But back to Secretary Williams. what he identified, and when we talk about Suzanne Taheri and I in this article for the Examiner, legitimate voting systems must answer these 3 questions. Definitely check it out. We address key questions in terms of the processes and procedures and the controls and safeguards that make Colorado, which was the 3rd state ever to implement a statewide vote-by-mail system, that make Colorado truly the gold standard in this regard. Now, there are issues, of course, that can come up in terms of human error, where you have, say, a partisan Secretary of State or a partisan clerk, where you may have some trust questions, for sure. But that's much more of an issue of the processes, the procedures that are in place, and whether or not what you have in the system is working to catch all of the issues that may come up, or most of the issues. The problem in many states across the country is that they don't have adequate safeguards for the ballot drop boxes, for example. Arizona mentions it in statute, but only says they must be secured, whereas Colorado has a very rigorous set of standards for what must be done in order to secure drop boxes with 24/7 surveillance and so forth. Whereas in other states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Georgia, they don't have any requirements in statute, don't even mention drop boxes in statute. And so we talked with Phil Klein, who's director of the Amistad Project at the Thomas More Society and is the former Attorney General of Kansas. He expressed concerns about ballot drop boxes that were being financed by the Center for Technology and Civic Life, funded in part by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. They were funding private funds for local areas, municipalities like Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for example. And these drop boxes didn't have the kind of security requirements. Whether they were secured appropriately or not, I don't know. That's a big question that Pennsylvania voters need to ask. But you also have the signature verification. You need a signature verification system in place to make sure that the ballots that are cast are legitimate. That's what count every legal vote means, is that the votes that are cast and accepted are legitimate, hence a signature verification process. And ideally, you have a good cure process. In Pennsylvania, the partisan Supreme Court tossed out the signature verification requirement only for mail-in ballots, what they think is predominantly put in by Democrat voters. So you could say, as Secretary Williams suggested might be the case, that you have a system that allows for Democrats to not have the same kind of standard as Republicans in effect, but also you don't have that kind of security, that kind of confidence with signature verification. I mean, these are things that are basic and fundamental to a voter system for confidence, for a sense of election integrity. If you don't have that, and you don't have the processes and procedures, safeguards and controls in place to catch issues, then you won't catch the issues. And that's what's going on with Dominion voting systems, for example. It does seem to me that it is not the software that is the problem, but it is the actors, the local officials who may screw up or may do something wrong with the systems intentionally. Who knows? But it is human error or human malfeasance that is at the crux of Dominion voting systems. And that's why Suzanne Taheri, former Deputy Secretary of State for Colorado, and I focused on these particular questions of the voter registration list, the ballot drop boxes and security of the ballots and the process and the chains of custody. And then also why we focused on signature verification. Those are key building blocks to a voting system that you can actually trust and have confidence in. And those are the keys, among the keys certainly, to ensuring a process that people can rely on. And that's the critical problem, or that's the critical issue here, is reliance on the results, trust in the results, integrity in the process. And so, I'm encouraging everybody to do an evaluation in your state and find out what are the processes. Get answers to these questions because, folks, what's happening right now in this election cycle with all the evaluations that are going on in the systems, what's happening right now across the country in terms of accusations of fraud and the lawsuits is not simply about 2020. It's not simply about Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. It is about the integrity of our system and the future of our elections in this country. It is about 2021. Local elections, 2022, the midterm elections, the next presidential election in 2024. We have to get this right. You have to get to the bottom of what's going on across the country. Because it is not simply 2020 and a presidential election that is at stake. It is the entire integrity of our elections in this country that are at stake. We need to get it right now and do the appropriate evaluations, come to the right conclusions, call out malfeasance, catch problems and human errors, catch the fraud, learn from this experience for the future. Because if you don't have trust in your elections, what do you have when it comes to the results and the legitimacy of the government? We have to evaluate this. We have to do due diligence. And we cannot excuse it and just brush it aside. This isn't partisan. This is American. And we all have to do our part to make sure that in our own communities and in our own states, we can have confidence in the process and the procedures and the safeguards and in the results in the end. Election integrity is critical. And that's what this is about. Well, that is it for us today here on this edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. My thanks to former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams for providing tremendous insights tonight here on the program and helping us to answer the questions that Suzanne Taheri and I both put into this piece for the Washington Examiner, hence Washington Examiner Wednesday today. Legitimate voting systems must answer these three questions. Be sure to check it out. We also have an op-ed in the Federalist. Look that up as well. Well, that is indeed it for us today. Thanks again to Secretary Williams. Thanks to you for watching and subscribing and sharing our content. Thanks to our partners at the Washington Examiner. Appreciate you being along for the ride. We'll stay on top of these ballot integrity issues and what we need to do to improve as time progresses, because this is not over. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. And as always, may God bless America.